So basically, if you remember, and you've heard me talk a little bit about this work before, I'm doing a systematic review on COVID-related unemployment and its association with health. And basically, I'm looking at COVID-related unemployment at the individual level and any resulting health impact it might have. So I haven't excluded any of my studies based on health outcomes. And what I thought I'd do today is just give you a brief overview of some of my early results, some of the ideas I have in terms of messaging some results that are starting to come out, and one of the main challenges that I'm having in particular. So just in terms of background, when I did my database search, I think I had a result of a little over 1,000 studies after deduplication and doing the sort of abstract title screening. I think I had about 270 studies that I fully assessed, and that dropped down to 46 finally included studies. But I have these additional search strategies of looking through the references of included studies and also looking at studies that have cited those included studies. And so I haven't finished those two search strategies yet. And of the 46 studies that I've identified so far, I've extracted data, I think, on 30 or so of them. Yeah.
Can I ask you a very quick question, Courtney? I don't want to break up your flow, but how did you decide? So you're searching this in COVID. How did you, just stepping back for a second, how did you set up your research question here? And how did you come to it?
Yeah, so there's been essentially decades of research on the relationship between unemployment and health. And most of it has found a negative association with a probably small to moderate effect size. And when I started thinking about that, there was all these job losses happening, like this shock of employment loss, that started wondering what the health effect of that would be. So that's how I came up with this study.
Okay, nice. So you're all tying it to the period of COVID. And so
yes,
is that just tied in the period of the search terms, or also it has to have something to do with COVID substantively?
Yeah, so the measure of unemployment has to be COVID-related unemployment. So it must be that the individuals, the respondents, lost their employment during the pandemic time period. So this is my data extraction table. It looks a lot like Cornelia's that we saw last week, extracting just the basic study characteristics. What I did is create a new worksheet that summarizes a lot of these main study characteristics. So here you can see that most of the studies are undertaken in high income countries. So a total of 23 of the 30 studies I've extracted so far are in high income countries, with only 6 in low income countries and 1 study that was looking at countries across the globe. In terms of study design, most of them have been cross-sectional in nature, with just a few looking at longitudinal data. If I combine all the ends of all the studies I've extracted so far, then we're looking at data that relates to 175,000 people. In terms of the health measures that these studies are looking at, they can basically be grouped into 3 groups. So the first is really, the majority of studies are looking at mental health or some aspect of quality of life or well-being. And the second group of studies are looking at health behavior change. So you can see that some of them have looked at like changes in alcohol consumption or changes in smoking, changes in physical activity, or changes in cannabis use. And then my other group right now is just the sort of mixed bag group. And this just consists of 3 studies, 1 looking at dental health, 1 looking at food insecurity, and 1 looking at child maltreatment. And then I have this sort of mixed bag study that's looking both at mental health and food insecurity. And for me, this is where things now start to get interesting, is when we look at, I just have to move my screen around, when we start looking at the employment measures that some of these studies are using. So the majority of studies are looking at individuals who in fact lost their employment during the COVID pandemic. But really there's two types of employment loss during COVID. So there's people who just lost their job entirely. And then there were people who were put on furlough. And essentially this means that they're still employees of whatever company they're working for, but they're on this sort of leave of absence. And this leave of absence might be paid or unpaid. It's not always clear. And then there's some studies that look at this idea of lost employment and furlough separately in their analyses. And then there's a handful of studies that look at job loss. Their variable of job loss sort of combines furlough with people who have lost their employment entirely. Some of them even combining this idea of hours that people have. If people have had a reduction in their hours of work, then they're combining all of these things into one variable, which to me seems problematic for thinking about some of these issues. And then if we just tabulate what the sort of associations look like when between unemployment and health, it's not too surprising that most of these are negative associations. So like I said, there's been decades of research finding these negative associations. There are a number of studies that have mixed results, and most of these studies are looking at multiple health outcomes. And it could be that one of these health outcomes, they find no effect. So typically these mixed result studies are finding negative results and possibly on one of their indicators, no effect. And then there's just 4 studies of these 30 that find no effect at all. And something that's interesting about this is that 3 of these studies are based in Australia. And then only 1 study so far has found a positive effect. And this was a study that was based in Norway, finding that people who experienced furlough were more likely to decrease their consumption of alcohol. So this was interesting. When I'm thinking in terms of messaging some of the results that are coming out of this analysis, I think there's 3 main messages that I'm sort of thinking about. So one is based on this idea that as I've gone through the studies, I found that there's basically 2 types of studies that are looking at this association. And one of these types is looking at the relationship, or sort of comparing the effect between job loss and health, and the effect between different employment changes and health. So let me give you an example. So looking, for example, at the relationship between job loss and health, or working from home and health. So comparing what those effect sizes are. And there's these other studies, you'll see I color code a lot of my work. There's these other studies that are looking at different predictors that have to do with COVID. So if people were experiencing self-isolation or had worries about contracting COVID. And so you can compare the effect sizes from job loss and health there, or the effect of these other predictors. So one idea I'm thinking about is comparing the effect sizes that we see in these 2 different ways. So how does the effect of job loss on health compare to the effect of working from home on health? Or how does the effect size of job loss and health look like in comparison to these other pandemic-related predictors like self-isolation or having these health worries? And the second sort of messaging idea that I'm thinking about looks, or it relies on some of these studies that are looking at potential moderators of the effect between job loss and health. And in particular, some that are seeing that people who experience job loss in the context of receiving unemployment benefits, there was less of a health effect in them rather than people who didn't receive unemployment insurance. So I think there's some possible messaging around the potential moderating effect of protective social policies. And then the third idea I'm thinking about in terms of messaging, and all of these ways that I'm thinking about messaging, I think have implications for how I'm structuring my results. So I like to think about these first before I start writing up the results. So this third idea is to compare the effect sizes that we've seen in previous studies. So I think most of these have been characterized as small or moderate effects. So I'm wondering, something I'm trying to think about as I'm going through and extracting this data is, are these small and moderate effects that we're seeing in the context of COVID, or are they larger or smaller? So those are the main ways I'm thinking of messaging some of the results. And probably my biggest challenge right now is that when I'm thinking about that first messaging idea about comparing these effect sizes across all these different predictors, is that it's a lot of data to extract. So some of these studies look at, for instance, like 22 different sorts of COVID-related predictors and their effect on health. So I just don't know how to capture all that data in a sort of extraction table like this in a way that's useful. So I'd be interested, I'll stop there, but I'd be interested in what people think about those messaging ideas. And also if anyone has any ideas or if they're struggling with the same thing about capturing this large amount of data in a small extraction table.
Just realized I'm on mute. Okay. First, Courtney, big thank you for sharing this with us. This is shaping up really nicely. And I have some thoughts on this, some ideas. You can tell this is going to be a really nice paper. And this is a really great time to have this conversation as you kind of package, stitch this up for a journal, especially as Jocelyn reminded us in the session how important it is to define the message. And you've got many viable messages, many interesting things emerging. So let me come back to some of my suggestions and thoughts, but first, Jorge, over to you.
I think that we discussed it here at some point, maybe about in the United States. I think that because they had the $1,300 that the government gave to people, and I think that for some people actually they had higher income during the pandemic. And so the effects were a little bit mixed, because you had this help from the government, you have sometimes unemployment benefits kicked in. So it was kind of mixed in the United States, just because this was an ad hoc policy, right? So maybe you want to differentiate between the US and maybe Europe, where the social networks were there and they were the ones that kicked in instead of this policy which was made for the pandemic. That's in particular to your second message. And I think for the first one, I had a note here. Health and also different. So basically you have, in the first message, you have two different approaches. The first one is you go from jobless to health. And in the second one, you're trying to see the channels that are in between the joblessness and the health, right?
In the second one, so some studies, they look at these like different categories of employment change. So one category is job loss, but another category is people have started working from home. Another category is that people have had their hours reduced. So they're comparing all these different types of employment changes. So one idea is to compare the effect size of employment loss to these different sorts of employment changes that have happened during COVID.
Okay, I see. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, just to clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point, though, that I think it might even be interesting, especially because like the US is coming out as being, having a large proportion of studies in this review, is even maybe having some sort of timeline. I'll have to look at when the stimulus was introduced and when the studies were undertaken. I think that'll be important to consider.
Could I hop in there?
Please.
Yeah, so that I'm jealous of the paper because it's awesome the way it's shaping up so far. I wish I did it myself. I think it's a super important and interesting topic area. I'm definitely biased, but I think that the messaging for my 2 cents, I'm certainly partial to the alternative policy context kind of framing. You can, it's already such a tight framework that has been applied to the previous recession by David and others. There's a recession, and then there's either austerity responses or social protection responses, and those can play a big role in mitigating or exacerbating the health or mental health or the effects on other social determinants of health. I don't know if our paper made it in there in the UK with the job retention scheme, but we were looking at transitions from employment. It was a baseline of employed individuals, and they either transitioned to being furloughed or unemployed without any furlough scheme supporting them, and basically found what you would expect is that but it's still cool to see it in the data. The furloughed people did not differ from those who were continuously employed, and then those who lost their jobs without any social protection, they had significant increases in food-related hardships. So, there's those within country studies, and then I don't know, that's one thing that I think that would be neat to look at is responses in, for example, like the SHARE data set. I don't know if anyone's used that yet, but I'm sure there's different regional, maybe subnational or national contexts that might moderate those associations. Anyways, all to say that I think it's a really cool idea, and I'm sure it's going to be a high impact study. So congrats.
Thanks very much. I think definitely that important messaging is that alternative policy. And I think you make a good point that because it's been such a strong message and it's based within a strong framework of studies that have used it before, that it's a good one to go for.
Just Manuel popped a question in through the chat here. Manuel, do you want to elaborate on that for us? It's a good question.
Yeah, thank you, Courtney, very much. I saw that you have some studies that were cross-sectional, others that were longitudinal. Have you thought of, when discussing then, grouping then, on the one hand, those who try to at least approach to the causal effect of employment loss on health, and then on the other hand, using those that show more correlational or association studies? Maybe they have different results.
Yeah, I think the main organizing strategy of the results section will probably be to go first by health outcome, but I think that will be an important distinction to bear in mind. There's only 4 longitudinal studies, so I think the best way to go is to start off with the health outcome and then talk about some of the results based on whether it's coming from cross-sectional or longitudinal.
Even if they are cross-sectionals, if, I don't know, for what I look at, if it's a COVID-specific questionnaire, sometimes they have retrospective questions, so at least you can control for employment status prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, even the cross-sectional ones have they have accounted for whether or not they were unemployed before the pandemic. So in fact, I didn't include any studies where it was where I couldn't tell whether the unemployment was COVID related.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. It actually comes out in the quality. One of the many important things in quality assessment is also the baseline, how that baseline was assessed, and what were the comparison groups. And that might be helpful in your messy Excel sheet to make that explicit and start looking at heterogeneity by it. I think those are really good, helpfful points, Manuel. I think this is helpful generally to some of you who are at the stage of analyzing your data and trying to see, well, this is where the research magic happens. What are the messages that emerge? And I think your big question, several of you, Jorge and John highlighted, I see the big question as well on, we know unemployment is bad for health. is this time any different? Would we expect it to be different? We've learned a lot how to buffer people now from the shocks of unemployment, and there have been a lot of protection packages put in place that vary considerably across countries, right? And it does look like, right, okay, Australia is interesting because it didn't have as initial bad COVID wave, but people did lose their jobs because of COVID. You may be able in the discussion to come back and say something about that. Did the furlough schemes help? But there's a lot of reasons to think, past research on unemployment hasn't really looked at furlough as much. Some studies have. But I really think that the really important contribution here is that you're able to kind of zoom out and look at a lot of the different protective schemes that were put in place and make some sense out of them. And it looks like that those UK furlough schemes, right? I often thought, well, a job is so important to your sense of identity. Well, you haven't lost your job, so you could still keep up your sense of identity. But this says something deeper sociologically as well, that just you may keep your sense of identity, but you're still not able to go through the motions and those habits. I don't want to get too far into this. Gabor, you can think theoretically where I'm going with that in sociology, but that the kind of your rhythm and routines in life have been completely disrupted as well, leaving people feeling disoriented. So it's very interesting that the furlough scheme isn't as protective to health as we might have thought it would be. Yeah. So I do think that I would strongly suggest focusing the message around those big policy questions.
Yeah, it's really hard not to get distracted by these other ideas that seem like cool in the data, like just I don't know, just to look at.
That's not to say don't put them in. It's just the centerpiece for defining the message, and then you can kind of tuck in second order hypotheses or pull out from the discussion things that roll out the carpet for your future studies in this area, right? I think there's a big question. I mean, COVID is going to change the way work is centralized. And we already see now countries offering the option of whether people even want to return to the office in a post-COVID world. And that question about working from home, what does that mean for people? If they do they end up more socially isolated, or is that offset by their autonomy in their lives to manage their time better? These are these are still really open questions. So I don't want you to lose sight of those. This one other thing, the value, I think John, Gabor, also thinking for you here, what's really nice here is that the systematic review, I think Courtney is really opening up a research agenda in this space and helping you define what some gaps are and where is this conversation going to go in unemployment and health, a conversation that's been going from the 70s and 80s. And it's still pretty active. Manuel just did a comment piece on the cyclicality of the economic cycles and health, and getting into some of this literature that Chris Room opened up, saying that recessions are good for your health. Economists love to have this contradictory finding idea, even when it doesn't hold up really, or haven't fleshed it out because they're producing for economists. But yeah, Manuel, do you see any points of intersection in that discussion on the economic side and where Courtney's going? Because I know you've just written about this.
No, I think regarding the policy interest definitely is comparing the social protection system, right? So, but the response pretty much in every country has been very different to the one to the recession, to the deep recession, and also the expectation of the recession is expected to be shorter, right? Even though we are growing again. So I don't really think it's comparable to so I don't think it's worth it to go into the effect on big recession, because this has been a different one, right? Also, again, it's challenging to see, especially mental health, whether the effect comes from the unemployment itself or from the whole stress situation of lockdown and so on, because actually for some people being employed means also leaving home, right? Where for others being unemployed means not leaving home at all. So that has to be bear in mind also in the discussion, I believe.
Yeah.
That's, I think one strength of some of the studies that look at all these other predictors that are associated with the pandemic and see how that relates to job loss and health, or other ones that are controlling for it in their models.
Yeah, I think Courtney, just speaking of quality assessment, I think a bespoke quality assessment would actually be helpful to you.
Mhm.
Also, you can anticipate what are some of the big confounders that you need to deal with in these studies. Would just give more substantive meaning to that rather than kind of a vanilla, some of the checklists that are off the shelf on there. We might want to think about that. I like also your idea of comparing the association of unemployment with some of the other effects that were quantified in studies where possible, like Manuel talked about. What was the effect of the lockdown on people's mental health, if they distinguish that, or the effect of actually getting COVID or fear of COVID on their mental health, just to kind of put the magnitude of these hardships in perspective for people.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, one of the confounding issues I've been thinking about is if people have, whether the study has accounted for whether people actually have caught COVID during, and how that might be confounding some of the health impacts that we see.
Yeah, it would also be really interesting. I mean, in theory, kind of like Jorge's here, no one should lose their job because they caught COVID. But
Right.
in practice, I'm sure that has happened. So even just documenting a couple cases of that, if that comes out, would be really interesting for your discussion section.
Can I also add something? Yeah, I think it'd be very interesting to look at the different categories within the group sector. Which sector did the population work on? Because I'm sure if you work on, for example, hospitality, things are a little bit more difficult if you work on low-income jobs, because you might have furlough, but most of your income is on tips or anything else, so you lose a lot of income. So it'd be interesting to look at the different categories within the job sector and look at if that had an impact or not as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that would be really interesting. What is coming out is that most of the studies, I mean, I think I found one that actually stratified their results by occupational group. So yeah, most of the effect sizes we see are this average over these sorts of different groups. Yeah, I think that's really important to mention.
I've got a quick question, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
And you might have covered this and I zoned out, but I was wondering how many of those studies would you classify as like quasi-experimental or natural experiment studies?
So this is also interesting. Most of these studies, maybe all of them, are based on these like online surveys that researchers created. So there's this other issue, I guess, that we're missing all these people in certain countries where there's going to be differential access to the internet.
Yeah. A paper that I really liked was from Julia Raifman and Jacob Bohr and Ethinder, I can never pronounce his last name, but it was Understanding Coronavirus in America study, and they were looking at a cohort of individuals in that longitudinal study that were, is this in your?
Yeah, it's one of my four.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, so I really like that one. So I was just curious how many leverage those sort of techniques.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, but I think it tells you something that was one of 4 longitudinal studies.
Yeah, totally. Okay. Lots of work to be done still.
Yeah, definitely.